He sat there in silence, surrounded by everything money could buy, and yet it felt like he had nothing. The restaurant shimmered with the soft glow of golden chandeliers. Crystal glasses clinked gently, laughter floated through the air, and the scent of roasted truffle and fine wine danced across marble floors. But at table 9, there was silence. Richard Cole, one of the wealthiest men in New York City, sat across from his son, Ethan, 9 years old, fragile, locked in a wheelchair that seemed far too big for his tiny frame. His hands trembled as he tried to lift the spoon from the plate in front of him. His father watched, expressionless, as the spoon slipped and fell again. The sound of metal on porcelain echoed louder than anything else in that restaurant. And then, the quiet returned. Richard looked away. He couldn't bear it. He couldn't bear himself. Every time he saw Ethan struggle, he saw his own failure reflected in those innocent eyes. A failure to be there, a failure to love, a failure to even understand what being a father truly meant. But tonight, guilt had dragged him here, a dinner he didn't want, a silence he didn't know how to break. And then she appeared, a young woman in a simple uniform, her name tag slightly crooked, Sarah Miller. She moved between tables with the calmness of someone who had learned how to smile through pain. Her hair was tied back loosely, a few strands falling across her face as she carried a tray of steaming plates. When she reached table 9, she stopped, just for a moment, because she saw Ethan, his small hands trying to grasp a napkin, his head tilting sideways, his lips parting like he wanted to speak but couldn't. And something in her heart broke. Quietly, "Good evening," she said softly. "Welcome to Bellagio's." Her voice was warm, gentle, like a melody cutting through the cold air. Richard nodded without looking up. "Just the usual," she smiled faintly. "Of course." As she turned to leave, she noticed Ethan staring at her, his eyes wide, hopeful. So she stopped and knelt down beside him. "Hey there," she whispered. "Are you hungry?" Ethan blinked. A small smile began to form, weak but pure. Sarah smiled back. "I'll make sure your food's extra warm, okay?" He couldn't reply, but his eyes said everything. When she left, Richard finally exhaled, like he'd been holding his breath for years. He watched her walk away. Something about her presence unsettled him, not because she was beautiful, but because she cared. Minutes passed. The food arrived. Steaming dishes, a glass of aged wine for Richard, and a small plate of mashed potatoes for Ethan. Richard scrolled through his phone. Emails, deals, mergers, numbers that meant everything and nothing at the same time. He didn't notice Ethan trying again and again to hold his fork. Didn't notice the tear rolling down the boy's cheek, but Sarah did. From across the room, she saw the struggle, the way Ethan's hand trembled, the way his father didn't look up even once, and without thinking, she moved. She came over quietly, kneeling beside Ethan once again. "May I?" she whispered. The boy blinked, slowly nodded. Sarah gently took the fork, scooped a bit of potato and raised it to his lips. He hesitated, then opened his mouth. She smiled. "There you go, champ." Richard looked up from his phone, his brow furrowed. "What are you?" Sarah glanced at him, still calm. "Just helping." He froze. Something about the way she said it, without hesitation, without fear, disarmed him. He put the phone down slowly. For the first time that night, he watched. He watched as his son smiled. He watched as laughter flickered across Ethan's face like sunlight breaking through clouds. He watched as Sarah spoke to him like he was a normal kid, not a patient, not a burden, and in that moment, Richard felt something he hadn't felt in years. Shame. Because it took a stranger, someone earning tips, not millions, to remind his son what love looked like. The restaurant faded around him. The laughter, the music, the clinking glasses, gone. All that existed was this moment. A waitress, a boy, and a father realizing how far he had fallen. Sarah fed Ethan patiently, joking softly between bites. "You're doing great. You know what? I think you're stronger than my little brother." "Don't tell him I said that." Ethan laughed, or tried to. The sound that came out was half choked, half joyful. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she kept smiling. When she looked up, Richard was staring. For a long second, neither spoke. And then Richard did something he hadn't done in years. He smiled back. Faintly. Awkwardly. But it was real. Later that night, after the plates were cleared, Sarah returned to check on them. "Would you like dessert?" she asked gently. Richard shook his head. "No, thank you," then paused. Actually, maybe he would. Ethan's eyes widened. Sarah grinned. "I think I know exactly what he'll love." Minutes later, she returned with a small bowl of chocolate mousse, topped with a cherry. She placed it in front of Ethan and whispered, "Extra chocolate. My secret recipe." Richard laughed quietly. "Your secret recipe, huh?" Sarah smiled. "Well, technically the chef's, but he doesn't smile as much when I say it's mine." For the first time in a long while, Richard felt warmth, real human warmth, the kind money couldn't buy, the kind he'd long forgotten. When the meal ended, Sarah came to clear the table. "Everything okay?" she asked softly. Richard looked at her for a long time. His voice low. It was more than okay. Their eyes met. She smiled, kindly, not expectantly. "I'm glad," he hesitated, then reached for his wallet. She stopped him. "No rush, sir. Take your time." But he wasn't reaching for the bill. He took out a card, sleek, black, heavy, and slid it toward her. "My name's Richard Cole," he said quietly. "If you ever need anything at all, call this number." Sarah blinked. I couldn't," he smiled. "You already did, tonight." She looked down, unsure how to respond. "I was just doing my job." Richard shook his head. "No. You did something I forgot how to do." He looked at Ethan, smiling, sleepy, content. "You cared." When they left, Sarah watched from the doorway. The city lights glowed outside, neon reflections shimmering on the wet pavement. Richard pushed Ethan's wheelchair through the glass doors, holding an umbrella above his son's head as rain began to fall. For a brief second, Sarah saw it. Something change in him. The stiffness in his posture softened. The distance in his eyes faded. He leaned down and whispered something to Ethan that made the boy giggle. And just like that, they were gone. That night, Richard sat alone in his penthouse. The skyline burned through the window, endless towers of light, cold and bright. He poured himself a drink but didn't touch it. His mind replayed the scene over and over again. The spoon falling, the smile, the waitress feeding his son like it was the most natural thing in the world, and he realized he'd spent years building an empire. But somewhere along the way, he'd lost his soul. He set the glass down, walked to Ethan's room. The boy was asleep, peaceful, a soft smile still lingering on his lips. Richard sat beside him, whispering softly, "I'm sorry, buddy. I should have been here. I should have seen you. I promise. I will now." He leaned down and kissed his forehead. It was awkward, hesitant, but it was real, and outside the city kept shining. But for the first time in a long time, so did he. The morning light crept slowly through the curtains of the Cole penthouse, painting soft gold across the marble floor. For the first time in years, Richard Cole wasn't thinking about stock prices or meetings. He was thinking about a smile, Ethan's smile. That one moment, when Sarah fed him, and he laughed. It replayed in Richard's mind like a heartbeat he couldn't ignore. He sat at the breakfast table, untouched toast beside his coffee, scrolling through his phone, pretending to read the news. But his eyes were lost, searching for something he didn't understand. He'd built skyscrapers, bought companies, reshaped industries, but he couldn't build a bridge to his own son until that night, until that waitress. Hours later, Richard's assistant entered his office. "Sir, your meeting with the board is in 20 minutes. Richard nodded absently. "Cancel it," the assistant blinked. "Cancel, sir?" "Yes, I have something more important." He didn't know why he was driving back there. The restaurant from last night, Bellagio's. He told himself he just wanted to thank her properly, maybe tip her more. But deep down he knew it wasn't about money. It was about a feeling he hadn't felt in years. Humility. When he arrived, the lunch crowd was just beginning. Waiters rushed between tables. The smell of fresh bread and garlic filled the air. And there she was. Sarah, her hair tied back, same gentle smile, same energy that somehow lit up every corner she walked through. When she saw him, she froze for a second. "Mr. Cole?" He smiled slightly. "You remember me?" "Of course," she said, setting down a tray. "And your son, Ethan, right? How's he doing?" "He's good," Richard replied softly. "Better than I've seen him in a long time. That's wonderful." He hesitated, then said, "I wanted to thank you. What you did last night, it meant more than you know." She smiled politely. "You don't have to thank me for being human, sir." Those words, simple, quiet, hit him harder than any boardroom insult or billion-dollar loss ever had. "You don't have to thank me for being human." He wanted to say more, but her manager called her away, so he sat down at the bar, ordered a coffee, and watched her work. For the next hour, he saw things he'd never noticed before. The way she comforted a crying child at another table. The way she helped an old couple read the menu. The way she smiled through exhaustion. The kind of smile that hides its own pain. He could see it now. The fatigue in her eyes. The small wince when she stretched her arm. She was holding the world together with nothing but kindness. And yet, she was glowing, not from wealth, from purpose. When her shift ended, she approached him. "You've been here a while," she said playfully. "You planning to buy the restaurant?" He laughed. "Not today," then paused. "Can I buy you coffee instead?" She hesitated. I'm not really supposed to." "It's just coffee," he said gently. Something in his tone convinced her. They sat by the window, rain starting to fall outside. The world beyond the glass looked softer now, quieter. "So," he said, "how long have you worked here?" 3 years, she replied. "It's not bad. Keeps me busy. And before that," she hesitated. "Nursing school. Had to drop out when my mom got sick then. Well, life happened." Richard nodded. "And now?" She smiled faintly. "Now I just try to make people's days a little better. Even if it's one plate of food at a time." There was silence, but not the cold kind. The kind that feels like understanding. Then Sarah asked, "What about you, Mr. Cole? What do you do?" He almost laughed. Everyone in New York knew what he did. But the way she asked, like she didn't care about money, titles, or fame, made him answer differently. "I build things," he said quietly. "Buildings, companies, but I think lately I've been trying to rebuild something else." "Yourself?" she asked softly. He looked at her. "Maybe." The rain grew heavier, tapping gently against the window. For the first time in years, Richard felt peace, not because the world was quiet, but because his heart was. When they said goodbye, Sarah simply smiled. "Tell Ethan I said hi," he nodded. "I will." But as he left, something tugged at him. He couldn't just walk away. That night, as he tucked Ethan into bed, Richard sat beside him longer than usual. "Ethan," he whispered, "do you remember the nice lady from last night?" Ethan blinked, nodded weakly. Richard smiled. "She reminded me what matters most." The boy's small hand reached out, touched his father's arm. And in that touch, Richard felt forgiveness. Days turned into weeks. Every Friday, Richard took Ethan to Bellagio's. Every time Sarah was there, and every time, Ethan smiled a little brighter. The staff began to notice. The billionaire who never spoke now laughed. The boy who never smiled now giggled. And the waitress who was once invisible became the center of light in their lives. One evening, Richard arrived without Ethan. Sarah frowned. "Where's your little partner in crime?" "He's at therapy," Richard replied. "But he wanted me to bring you this." He handed her a small drawing. It was scribbled in crayon, shaky lines and bright colors. A stick figure woman holding a spoon, feeding a small boy. At the bottom, Ethan had scrawled one word. Friend. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "He drew this?" Richard nodded. "He doesn't draw much, but he said this one's for her." She couldn't speak, just smiled through tears. "Tell him. It's perfect." As the weeks passed, something changed in Richard too. He started showing up to Ethan's therapy sessions. He canceled business, meetings just to take his son to the park. He laughed. Again, and it all began with one small moment as a stranger feeding his child. But life, as always, had its own tests. One evening, Richard arrived at Bellagio's, but Sarah wasn't there. He asked the manager. "She's been out for 2 days. he said. Family emergency, I think. Something inside Richard twisted. Without thinking, he called the number she'd written on a napkin weeks ago. For emergencies, she'd said, like if Ethan ever wanted more chocolate mousse. It rang twice. Then a weak voice answered, "Hello? Sarah, it's Richard. Are you okay?" There was a pause. "My mom. She's in the hospital. It's been tough," he exhaled. "Which one?" "St. Joseph's. I'll be there in 20 minutes. "Mr. Cole, you don't have to—" But he was already gone. The hospital corridors smelled of antiseptic and sadness. Richard found Sarah sitting outside a room, her head in her hands. He approached quietly. "Hey," she looked up, eyes red from crying. "I didn't expect you. You helped me," he said softly. "Let me help you." Inside the room, her mother lay motionless, frail, tubes and wires surrounding her. "I can cover the expenses," Richard said simply. "All of them." Sarah shook her head. "I can't let you—" "You can," he interrupted gently. "You gave my son a reason to smile. Let me do the same for you." Tears rolled down her cheeks. She whispered, "Why are you so kind to me?" He smiled faintly. "Because you reminded me that kindness still exists." Over the next few weeks, Richard took care of everything. The bills, the medication, the nurses. Sarah's mother slowly recovered, and Sarah, she began to see Richard differently. Not as a billionaire, but as a man learning to love again. Sometimes he'd visit with Ethan, bringing flowers. Sometimes he'd just sit beside her in the hospital garden, both in silence watching the sunset. It wasn't romance. It was something deeper. Connection, gratitude, humanity. One day, as they sat together, Sarah turned to him. "You know," she said softly, "you've changed." He looked at her. "How so?" "You smile more. You listen. You look alive." He nodded. "You know what's funny? I feel that way too," she smiled. "That's the gift of a smile. You gave it back to your son, and then he gave it back to you." That night, as Richard drove home, Ethan asleep in the back seat, he looked through the mirror at his son. Peaceful, dreaming, he whispered, "We'll make her proud, buddy. You and me." The city lights blurred around them, streaks of gold and silver reflecting on the windshield. And for the first time in a long time, Richard wasn't chasing money, he was chasing meaning, because one act of kindness had rewritten the story of his life.